The Room of Silence. The rain didn't fall like a storm that wanted attention. It fell like a secret, soft and patient, tapping the tall hospital windows as if the night itself were trying to speak without being overheard. Inside, the hallway lights were too bright for the hour, clean and white and almost cruel in how they made everything look the same. Every door, every shadow, every quiet breath held in people's chests. The smell of antiseptic lived in the air like a rule you couldn't break, and the steady beeping of monitors sounded less like technology and more like proof that time was still moving even when life felt paused. Outside those walls, the city buzzed with rumor and speculation, and in places where cameras waited, people whispered the way people always do when they think a famous person's pain belongs to them. But here, behind a simple number on a door, there was no fame. There was only silence, and a man who had spent a lifetime being gentle to strangers now learning what it felt like to be fragile. They said Keanu Reeves had been brought in after a late-night accident, that it happened fast, that help arrived late enough to scare everyone but early enough to save him, and the details were blurred on purpose because the hospital didn't want the circus. The staff had seen famous faces before. They knew the difference between celebrity and humanity. Still, something about this case felt different, not because of his name, but because of the way even nurses lowered their voices when they spoke about him, as if they could sense the weight he carried behind his quiet eyes, as if they knew this wasn't just a body healing, but a soul standing at a cliff edge deciding whether to step back or finally stop pretending it wasn't there. Sandra Bullock arrived without a show, without the armor people expected famous people to wear. She didn't come with a team that marched ahead of her like a warning. She came in a simple gray sweater and jeans, hair pulled back in a way that said she hadn't been thinking about style or headlines or angles, only about getting here. Her eyes looked tired, but not the tired of a long day. This was the tired of years, of memories you don't talk about and feelings you file away because life keeps demanding your attention elsewhere. She moved through the corridor with a slow steadiness that made the guards step aside without being asked, and even the people who recognized her didn't reach for their phones, because something in her face said, "Not today." She stopped outside room 17 and stood there long enough for her breath to catch, long enough for the world to narrow down to one door handle and one decision. A nurse approached, gentle and careful like she was approaching grief itself. "He hasn't spoken much since he woke up," the nurse said quietly, eyes soft with compassion. Sandra's throat tightened, and she didn't pretend she didn't understand what that meant. It wasn't ego that brought her here. It was history, and a quiet bond that had never needed public confirmation. She nodded once, and when her hand touched the handle, it trembled in a way she hated herself for. She took a deep breath anyway and stepped inside, and the dimness of the room made it feel like another world, half-closed blinds letting in a thin stripe of evening light, machines humming gently like distant insects, and there on the bed, Keanu lay pale and bruised, bandaged and still somehow familiar, as if his kindness had a shape that couldn't be injured. For a moment, Sandra couldn't speak. She pulled a chair closer and sat down slowly, the way people sit when they're afraid a sudden movement might break something delicate. She looked at his face, at the scratches on his cheek, at the tired lines around his eyes, and her chest filled with a strange ache that was part worry, part anger, part relief. She thought about every time life had tried to knock him down and he'd still stood back up, quietly, without demanding applause. She thought about long ago laughter on set, the small jokes that made hard days easier, the moments that never made the interviews because they were too real to be packaged. And she thought about the unspoken thing that lived between them, the thing people always tried to name for them, the thing they never fed because it was easier to leave a door closed than to risk what might happen if you opened it. "Finally," she whispered, voice barely there. Keanu's eyes opened slowly, blinking as if he had to travel a long distance just to return to the present. When he saw her, something shifted in his expression. No surprise, No performance, just a quiet relief that landed like a confession. "You came," he said, voice hoarse and tired, but real. Sandra forced a small smile even as her eyes burned. "Of course I came," she said. He stared at her for a long second, and she could feel the words he wasn't saying, the way he always carried feelings like they were dangerous objects he didn't want to drop near other people. "I didn't want you to see me like this," he murmured. "Don't be stupid," she replied, the softness cracking at the edges. "I've seen you through worse. Remember when we both got food poisoning in Mexico?" A faint smile tugged at his mouth, fragile but real, and the air in the room changed, like a locked window had opened just enough to let the night breathe. Then the silence returned, but it wasn't empty. It was full. It held memories and questions and the kind of affection that doesn't need constant words to stay alive. Sandra's gaze drifted to his hand resting on the blanket, wrapped in medical tape, and without thinking too hard, because thinking too hard would have stopped her, she reached out and held it. His skin was cool at first, and then, slowly, his fingers curled around hers as if his body recognized safety even when his mind was still fighting. "They said it was bad," she whispered. Keanu turned his face slightly away, not from her but from something inside himself. "It wasn't the first time," he said. Sandra frowned, her grip tightening. He swallowed, and when he looked back at her, his eyes held a tired honesty. "This one felt different," he admitted. She asked, and her voice went smaller, like she was afraid of the answer. Keanu paused for a long moment, and the machines filled the space between them with their calm beeps. "I thought maybe it was time to stop running," he said finally. Sandra's brow creased. He looked at her then, really looked, the way you look at someone when you're deciding whether to trust them with the part of you that hurts. "From feeling too much," he whispered. "From losing too many people." Those words hit Sandra like cold water. She had always known his kindness came with shadows, that behind the calm was a history of heartbreak he rarely spoke about. People praised him for being humble, for being quiet, for being gentle. They didn't see how sometimes gentleness was a shield, how silence could be a way of surviving. Sandra leaned forward slightly, her eyes shining. "You're still here," she said. "That means something. Maybe it's not a punishment." Keanu's gaze flickered with something like disbelief. "I don't know what to do with chances," he admitted. "I've been good at surviving." The door opened softly, and a nurse stepped in, checked the IV, adjusted a setting, and left without making the moment about herself. The world kept moving outside, phones buzzing, reporters speculating, strangers projecting stories onto a man they'd never met. But inside this room, time slowed down until it felt like only two people existed. Sandra leaned back, eyes never leaving him. Keanu's mouth lifted just slightly. "I did call," he said. Sandra blinked, almost offended. He shook his head gently, like he wasn't arguing, only stating truth. "I did," he repeated, voice weak but steady. Sandra's breath caught, and for a second she felt the past tilt toward her like a wave. His eyes held hers, soft and strangely sad. "Maybe it wasn't meant to go through," he said with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. Sandra looked away, blinking fast because she refused to cry first. "You always talk like life's a movie," she muttered. "And you always act like it isn't," he replied quietly. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was honest. It was two people staring at a door they had both refused to open, not because they didn't care, but because they cared too much and didn't want to lose what they already had. Keanu's eyelids grew heavier, and Sandra thought he was drifting off again. She shifted in her chair, careful not to disturb him, and started to stand because she knew he needed rest, and she didn't want to be selfish. But his hand tightened around hers, and the sudden strength startled her. "Stay," he whispered, eyes barely open. Sandra froze, throat tightening. She sat back down immediately, like the chair had become the only place in the world she was allowed to be. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, and this time she meant it with a seriousness that surprised even her. His breathing slowed, and for a moment it felt like the room itself was breathing with him, as if the air had decided to be gentle. Outside, thunder rumbled far away, and the rain grew heavier, and Sandra watched his face, the stubborn, quiet strength even in weakness, and realized something that made her chest ache. Keanu had always carried other people's pain like it was his job, like being kind meant never needing anything back. He'd been the person who showed up, who donated quietly, who listened, who helped, who made sure everyone else felt seen. But who had ever made sure he felt seen? Sandra swallowed hard and leaned closer. "You're not alone," she whispered. Keanu didn't answer with words, but a single tear slipped from the corner of his eye. Sandra reached up and wiped it away gently, as if wiping away the lie that he had to do everything by himself. In that moment, cameras and gossip and fame disappeared. There was only a quiet hospital room, the sound of rain, and two people choosing kindness, even when fear had every reason to win. Night deepened, and the city lights outside blurred through wet glass. Sandra stayed even when her body begged for sleep, because leaving felt like dropping a fragile glass on a hard floor. Keanu eventually fell into a real sleep, his face relaxing for the first time since she arrived, and Sandra sat by the window watching the world move like distant theater. She noticed the flowers on the table, the cards from friends, the little notes with well wishes, and then her eyes found something that made her heart stutter. A folded letter placed neatly on the nightstand beside his bed. It was sealed, and on the front, in familiar handwriting, was her name. Sandra's fingers hovered in the air. Her first instinct was to leave it alone, to respect privacy, to not cross lines. But the truth was, the line had always been blurry between them, not because they were careless, but because they had trusted each other in a way that didn't need labels. Her hands shook as she picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of it like a stone. She opened it carefully, and the words inside were simple but heavy, the kind of writing that felt like it had been pulled out of someone's chest at 2 a.m. He wrote about how fragile life was, how quickly everything could change, how silence wasn't always peace. He wrote about walls he built thinking they would protect him, and about how kindness was stronger than fear, something she had told him once long ago, when he had looked like someone pretending to be okay. And then the letter moved into a place that made her breath tremble, into a truth she had felt but never demanded, that she had been his constant, his real thing in a world that was too loud, his calm, even when he didn't feel like he deserved calm. He didn't write dramatic promises. He didn't write a confession meant for headlines. He wrote like a man leaving a piece of himself behind because he was afraid he wouldn't get another chance to speak. The letter ended without a signature, without a goodbye, only a quiet honesty that felt like someone placing their heart in your hands and praying you don't drop it. Sandra pressed the paper to her chest, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. "You idiot," she whispered, voice breaking. But she understood why he hadn't. Some people carry pain so carefully they start believing their love is a burden. A soft knock interrupted her spiral. A young doctor stepped in with a clipboard, surprised to see her still there. He spoke quietly, as if loud words would offend the room. "You've been here all night," he said. Sandra nodded without looking away from Keanu. "I couldn't leave," she replied. The doctor hesitated, then said something that felt both professional and personal. He was in bad shape when they brought him in. Physically, he's improving, but emotionally... He didn't finish the sentence because he didn't need to. Sandra nodded slowly. "I know," she whispered. When the doctor left, the room felt even quieter, as if it had swallowed his words. Dawn began to soften the darkness, painting pale colors across the walls. The hospital woke up. Distant footsteps, quiet voices, the faint smell of coffee in the hallway. Yet inside this room, everything still felt suspended between then and now, between what was said and what was avoided. Sandra placed the letter back exactly where she found it, like returning a sacred object to its altar, and leaned closer to Keanu's sleeping face. "Wake up soon," she whispered. Her voice cracked at the end, and she hated herself for the fear she couldn't hide, the fear of losing someone who had mattered more than she had ever admitted out loud. As if her words had reached him in whatever place sleep took him, his fingers twitched, then moved, then found her hand again like a compass, finding north. His lips moved in a faint murmur, broken and soft. Sandra leaned in. "Don't go," he breathed. Her eyes filled instantly. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised. And in that promise, something inside her shifted, something that had been waiting years for the courage to become real. Minutes later, another knock came, and this time it wasn't medical. A man in a dark suit entered, polite but serious, holding a folder like a responsibility. He nodded at Sandra and glanced at Keanu as if confirming his identity without needing a name. "Ms. Bullock," he said softly, voice careful. Sandra's stomach tightened. The man opened the folder. "Mr." The sentence landed like a bell in the silence. Sandra blinked, certain she misheard. The man nodded. "There's no immediate family listed." Sandra's breath caught. She didn't know whether to feel honored, terrified, or both. She looked at Keanu, fragile, sleeping, human, and realized that beneath all the fame was a man who had chosen her as his safe place without even having to ask permission. The man continued, "We'll need your signature for post-care documents when he's stable." Sandra stared down at the papers, then back at Keanu, and something in her chest settled into certainty. "Okay," she said quietly. The man's expression softened with respect. "He's lucky to have you," he said, then left her with the folder and the weight of what it meant. Sandra sat back down, the rain still whispering against the glass, the morning light beginning to stretch across the floor. She held Keanu's hand and felt, for the first time in a long time, that life had pushed them into a moment they couldn't ignore. Whatever walls had existed, whatever silence had been maintained out of fear or pride, something was cracking open now. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way sunlight enters a room when you finally pull the blinds apart. She looked at his face and thought, "This isn't an ending. This is the start of a truth neither of us can run from anymore." And as the city outside continued to chase stories, inside room 17, the real story began. One about kindness that doesn't quit, pain that doesn't get the final word, and two souls learning that sometimes the bravest thing isn't surviving. It's letting someone stay. The paper that changed the air. Morning arrived without celebration, the way it often does in places where people are fighting quiet battles. The hospital didn't care about sunrise the way the outside world did. It stayed the same bright white, the same steady hum of machines, the same soft rhythm of footsteps passing like waves in a long corridor. Yet Sandra felt the change anyway, not because the walls looked different, but because she did. She had spent the night in that chair by Keanu's bed, her body stiff from staying still for too long, her eyes sore from refusing sleep, and her thoughts restless, like birds trapped behind glass. Every time she tried to close her eyes, she saw the same things. Keanu's pale face, the fragile rise and fall of his chest, the letter with her name on it, and the way his hand had clung to hers, as if letting go would make him disappear. She had promised she wouldn't go, and in a world where promises were often used as decoration, she felt the weight of this one like something sacred. Outside, the rain softened into a lighter drizzle, and the city began to wake up. But inside the room, time moved slowly, respectfully, as if it knew something important was happening here. At some point, a nurse came in with fresh linens and a gentle voice, asking Sandra if she needed anything. And Sandra almost laughed at the question because what she needed wasn't coffee or a blanket. It was certainty. It was clarity. It was some guarantee that life would stop threatening the people she cared about. She shook her head politely, thanked the nurse, and kept her gaze on Keanu, watching his face for any change, any sign that the man she knew was returning fully to himself. When he finally woke, it wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden gasp, no miraculous moment of music swelling in the background. It was simply his eyelids fluttering, his brow tightening as if he was climbing back from a deep place, and then the quiet shift of his gaze, finding her. His eyes looked tired, but there was something else, too. Something like surprise that she was still there, like he had expected the world to move on without him. Sandra leaned forward before he could even speak, and her voice came out softer than she intended. "Hey," she said, as if she were greeting him at a cafe instead of a hospital bed. Keanu blinked slowly, then let out a breath that sounded like he'd been holding it for days. "You stayed," he murmured. Sandra's smile was small, but it carried stubborn truth. "I told you I wasn't going anywhere," she replied, and something in his expression cracked, not into tears but into relief, the kind that makes a person look younger for a second because the burden shifts off their shoulders. He tried to move his arm, winced, then let it rest again, and Sandra watched him with the same quiet fear she had been trying to hide all night. She asked. Keanu's eyes drifted toward the window, toward the pale gray light outside. Sandra nodded slowly. "That part matters," she said, and he looked back at her as if he needed her to say it again, as if he needed someone else to declare that his existence mattered, that his life wasn't just something the world consumed for entertainment. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, only heavy. Sandra could feel questions pressing against her ribs, not curiosity, but the urgent need to understand what had happened, what he had been thinking, what the accident had shaken loose inside him. She thought about the letter again, about the words he had written as if he didn't believe he'd get another chance, and she wondered if he remembered writing it, or if he had buried it in the night like a confession he hoped she'd never find. She didn't bring it up yet. Not because she was afraid to talk, but because she knew Keanu. She knew he needed to arrive at truth the way someone approaches a wild animal, slowly, carefully, without sudden movements. Instead, she asked him simple things. Did he want water? Did he want the blinds adjusted? Did he want to listen to music? Each question was ordinary, but beneath them was a deeper message. "I'm here. I'm paying attention. Your comfort matters." Keanu answered quietly, with that calm humility that had always made people underestimate the storms inside him. Sandra exhaled, almost amused at how polite he sounded even in vulnerability. "I'm staying," she said. Keanu's mouth lifted into a faint smile. "I'm not good at needing people," he admitted. Sandra leaned back in the chair, letting the truth settle between them. "Then consider this practice," she said. A little later, the doctor returned with updates, speaking in that steady tone people use when they want to sound reassuring without promising too much. He explained that Keanu had injuries that would heal, that recovery would take time, that stress could slow things down, and that rest wasn't a luxury, but a requirement. Keanu listened without arguing, and Sandra could tell that the accident had done something to him. Not physically, but mentally. Like it had forced him to stop and look at how tired he truly was. When the doctor left, Keanu stared at the ceiling as if he were counting invisible cracks. "It's weird," he said quietly. Sandra didn't respond right away. She waited until he looked at her. She asked. Keanu swallowed, then his voice dropped into something more honest. "I think healing is letting yourself admit you're not okay," he said. Sandra felt her chest tighten because he wasn't just talking about the accident. He was talking about years, about grief, about loneliness disguised as independence. "Then you're doing it," she said softly. "You're admitting it, and I'm witnessing it." Keanu's eyes softened, and for a moment he looked like someone who had forgotten what kindness felt like when it wasn't something he was giving to others, but something being offered to him. It was near midday when Sandra stepped out into the hallway to stretch her legs and clear her head. She hadn't eaten properly, and her body felt like it had been running without fuel, but she didn't want to leave him alone for long. The corridor was busier now, nurses chatting quietly, wheelchairs rolling past, the distant sound of a cart of medical supplies moving like a slow train. She leaned against the wall for a second, rubbing her temples, when she noticed a familiar tension in the air. Two security guards stood farther down, not the usual hospital staff, but hired muscle with earpieces, scanning faces like they were expecting trouble. Sandra's stomach tightened. She knew what that meant. Fame had a smell, and it followed people even into places like this. She walked back quickly, and when she entered Keanu's room, she saw him staring at the door as if he could sense what she had seen. "They're outside," he said quietly. Sandra's lips pressed into a thin line. Keanu nodded once, eyes tired. Sandra felt anger flare, not loud anger, but the kind that burns in your chest because it's unfair. "You're not a headline," she muttered. Keanu's voice was calm, but it carried something heavy. "Sometimes I feel like I've been a story more than a person," he admitted. Sandra walked to the window and glanced down, seeing the distant cluster of cameras like insects drawn to light. She turned back, steadying her voice. "Then we don't feed them," she said. "We keep this private." Keanu stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, like he wanted to believe it was possible. That was when Sandra noticed the nightstand again, and the letter resting there, still where she had placed it back. The air in the room seemed to change the moment her eyes landed on it, as if the paper itself carried a gravity. She could have pretended she hadn't read it. She could have locked it away in silence like so many things they had both avoided. But she realized something in that moment. Silence was what had cost them years. Silence was what had made them strong in public and lonely in private. If she truly meant what she promised, if she truly intended to stop him from facing everything alone, then she couldn't keep protecting him from his own truth. Sandra walked to the nightstand, picked up the envelope and held it carefully. Keanu's gaze followed her, and his expression tightened slightly, like someone seeing their own heart exposed. "You read it," he said, not accusing, just stating. Sandra looked at him, her eyes steady. "I did," she admitted. Keanu's throat moved as he swallowed. He looked away, embarrassed in a way that made him seem younger, less like the calm figure everyone admired, and more like a man who didn't know where to put his feelings. "I wrote it at night," he murmured, "when I couldn't sleep. I didn't think." Sandra stepped closer, holding the letter against her chest. "You didn't think you'd have to face me with it," she finished gently. Keanu's jaw tightened, then loosened again. "Yeah," he whispered. Sandra pulled the chair closer to his bed and sat down, and the room felt smaller, not because of the walls, but because of the honesty now sitting between them. She didn't read it out loud. She didn't need to. The words had already carved themselves into her memory. Instead, she said the one thing she knew he needed to hear. "I'm not scared of your feelings, Keanu," she said quietly. "I'm not scared of your pain." Keanu's eyes shimmered, and he let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped in him for years. "I didn't want to be a burden," he admitted. Sandra's voice softened, but it held firm truth. "You're not a burden," she said. "You're human." Keanu stared at her, and for a moment the silence was so thick it felt like it had weight. Then he said something that shook her, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so plain. "You were always the one person I could breathe around," he confessed. Sandra's eyes burned again, and she forced herself not to look away. "Then breathe," she whispered. "Right now. No performance. No pretending." Keanu's fingers twitched, and he reached for her hand again, holding it with a gentleness that felt like gratitude and fear all at once. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. Sandra's smile trembled. "Neither do I," she said. "But I know how to show up." Keanu closed his eyes for a second, and when he opened them, there was a quiet decision in his gaze. "I used to think being strong meant not needing anyone," he said. Sandra nodded slowly. "Pride is just fear wearing nicer clothes," she said, and Keanu let out a soft, almost silent laugh. "That's a good line," he murmured. "Keep it," she replied. His expression softened, and he squeezed her hand slightly, like he was agreeing without making a big deal out of it. Later, as the afternoon light shifted and painted the room in softer tones, Sandra stepped out again briefly to speak with the hospital administrator about the recovery paperwork. The man in the suit returned with his folder, calm and professional, explaining options for private rehabilitation, home recovery, and security arrangements. Sandra listened, nodding, signing where necessary, but inside her mind there was only one thought. This can't just be about his body. This has to be about his life. She returned to the room and found Keanu watching the rain again, his expression distant. "They want to send you home soon," she said, trying to sound casual. Keanu looked at her, then down at his bandaged arm. "Home," he repeated softly, as if the word felt strange. Sandra understood why. Home wasn't always comfort. Sometimes home was a place filled with echoes. "You don't have to do it alone," she said. Keanu's gaze lifted. He asked, voice quiet. Sandra didn't hesitate. "I'm saying it," she replied. "If you want privacy, I'll help protect it. If you want silence, I'll sit in it with you. If you want to talk, I'll listen." Keanu stared at her like he was trying to figure out if he deserved that kind of loyalty. He asked, and the question wasn't suspicious. It was wounded. Sandra's eyes softened. "Because you've spent your whole life showing up for people," she said. The room went quiet again, but this time the silence didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like a pause before something new. Sandra thought the hardest part would be saying the truth out loud. But she realized the real hard part was accepting it, accepting that care could be mutual, that support didn't have to be one-sided, that even strong people needed someone to hold their hand when the world got too loud. Keanu leaned back against the pillows, and his voice came out softer than before. "I don't want the world to turn this into something ugly," he admitted. Sandra nodded. "Then we don't give them the pieces they can twist," she said. Keanu looked at her, and in his gaze was something that had been missing earlier. Something like hope. Not the loud, flashy hope people sell in speeches, but the quiet hope that arrives when you realize you're not alone in the room anymore. He reached toward the nightstand and touched the edge of the letter gently, like it was a reminder of his own courage. "I wrote that because I thought I might not get another chance," he admitted. Sandra leaned closer. "Then take this chance," she whispered. Keanu's eyes held hers, and he nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Okay," he said, and the word sounded like a door opening. But life, as Sandra knew too well, didn't always allow peace to settle without testing it. As evening approached, a knock came at the door, softer than the others, hesitant, like the person outside wasn't sure they deserved entry. Sandra turned, expecting a nurse, but when the door opened, it was someone unfamiliar, a woman standing in the hallway with a small envelope clutched tightly in her hand. eyes red as if she had been crying for hours before working up the courage to come here. The nurse beside her looked uncertain.
"Ms. Bullock," the nurse whispered. "She says it's important."
Sandra's stomach tightened again, not with jealousy, not with drama, but with instinct. Something was about to change. She looked at Keanu, who had gone still, his gaze narrowing as he tried to focus past the dim light. The unknown woman stepped inside slowly, and the air in the room shifted as if the rain outside had suddenly decided to fall harder. Sandra stood, not aggressive, but protective in the way someone becomes when they've promised to stay. The woman's voice trembled when she spoke.
"I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't know who else to come to."
Keanu's eyes searched her face, and then his expression changed. Confusion, recognition, and a quiet shock all tangled together. He whispered, as if saying the name was unlocking a door he hadn't opened in years. The woman nodded, tears gathering again.
"Hi,"
she said, and her fingers tightened around the envelope as if it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. Sandra felt her heart pound, not because she feared competition, but because she could sense the weight of whatever this woman had brought into the room. Some truths don't knock politely. They arrive shaking. Keanu tried to sit up, wincing, and Sandra moved automatically to support him, her hand behind his back, steady and careful. Claire looked at Sandra, then back at Keanu, her voice cracking.
"I didn't come to hurt you," she said.
The room fell into that deep hospital quiet where even the machines seemed to wait. Sandra felt the air thicken, and she understood suddenly that part one wasn't the beginning of change. This was. Whatever came next would reshape everything, and the only way through it would be the very lesson the story was trying to teach. Truth doesn't destroy you when it's carried with love. It frees you when it's finally spoken. The truth that refused to stay buried. The room seemed to shrink the moment Claire stepped fully inside, not because the walls moved, but because the air itself felt heavier, as if it carried the weight of years that had never been spoken out loud. The soft hum of the machines suddenly sounded louder, more aware, like witnesses that had seen too much to stay neutral. Sandra stood near Keanu instinctively, not in front of him, not shielding him, but close enough that her presence said without words that he wasn't alone in whatever was about to unfold. Keanu's eyes stayed fixed on Claire, searching her face the way someone searches an old photograph, trying to place a memory that feels familiar but distant, like a song you once knew all the words to but haven't heard in years. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," he said quietly, his voice steady but uncertain, as if even speaking her name had stirred something fragile inside him. Claire swallowed hard, her hands shaking around the envelope she carried, and for a moment she looked like she might turn around and leave, like the courage that brought her here was already slipping away. But she didn't. Instead, she took a breath that trembled all the way through her body and stepped closer, stopping just far enough away to respect the invisible boundary of his bed.
"I didn't know if you'd want to," she replied softly.
Sandra watched closely, not with suspicion, but with awareness. She could tell this wasn't a random visit or a dramatic interruption. There was something deeply personal in the way Claire avoided looking directly at Keanu for too long, something raw in how her voice wavered between strength and fear. Keanu shifted slightly, wincing as pain shot through his arm, and Sandra immediately adjusted the pillow behind him without needing to ask. Claire noticed the gesture, her eyes flicking between them, and something unreadable crossed her face. Not jealousy, not resentment, but recognition.
"I heard about the accident," Claire said after a pause. "When I saw it on the news, I couldn't sleep."
Keanu nodded slowly, like he understood more than she was saying. "You always hated unfinished sentences," he murmured, almost to himself. Claire's lips trembled into a sad smile. "She asked." Keanu exhaled. "I remember a lot more than people think," he said.
Sandra felt a quiet ache settle in her chest, not because she felt excluded, but because she realized how many pieces of Keanu's life had lived quietly in the background, unacknowledged, unseen, like rooms in a house no one ever entered. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence wasn't empty, it was crowded with words waiting their turn. Finally, Claire gathered herself and held out the envelope. "This is for you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Keanu looked at it, then up at her. He asked. Claire hesitated, and Sandra could see the conflict tearing at her, the part of her that wanted to protect the past fighting with the part that was tired of carrying it alone. "It's proof," Claire said finally. Keanu frowned slightly. Claire's eyes filled with tears, and she looked down at her hands. "Of something I should have told you a long time ago," she replied. Sandra felt a chill run through her, the kind that comes when you sense the ground shifting under your feet. She didn't interrupt. She didn't ask questions. She stayed still because she knew this moment wasn't hers to control, only to support. Claire took another step closer, her voice shaking now. She asked quietly. Keanu's brow furrowed as he searched his memory. He said. Claire let out a short, broken laugh. "That's the one," she replied. "I worked there." Keanu's mouth lifted faintly despite the tension. "You kept apologizing for the coffee," he said. Claire nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks now. "You were kind to me when I didn't have much kindness in my life," she said. "You listened. You didn't ask questions." Sandra felt her throat tighten. This was Keanu as she knew him, the quiet kindness that didn't ask for recognition. But Claire's voice didn't stop there. It dipped into something heavier, something that made the room feel smaller. "I was scared back then," Claire continued. "I was barely surviving." Keanu's expression shifted, the faint smile fading as understanding began to form. "Claire," he said slowly, carefully. Claire closed her eyes, and when she opened them, there was no hesitation left, only truth. "I had a child," she said. The words landed softly, but their impact was enormous. Keanu froze, his breathing shallow, his eyes locked onto hers as if he were afraid to blink. Sandra's heart began to race, not because of fear for herself, but because she could see the way Keanu's world was tilting, the way something deep inside him was being pulled into the light whether he was ready or not. "He's 11 now," Claire continued, her voice breaking. The machines seemed to grow louder, the beeping sharper, as if the room itself reacted to the confession. Keanu didn't speak at first. His gaze drifted to the window, then back to Claire, then briefly to Sandra, as if he were trying to anchor himself to something solid. "You're saying," he began, then stopped, swallowing hard. Claire nodded, tears streaming freely now. Sandra felt her breath catch, but she didn't step back. She didn't pull away. She stayed exactly where she was, her hand still near Keanu's, because she knew that whatever shock she was feeling, it was nothing compared to what was happening inside him. Keanu closed his eyes for a long moment, his face tightening as memories rearranged themselves, as the past reshaped into something new and undeniable. When he opened his eyes again, they were glassy, but focused. He asked quietly, not angry, not accusing, just wounded. Claire shook her head desperately. "Because you were already breaking," she said. "You had lost someone you loved. You were carrying so much grief, and I couldn't add to it." Keanu's jaw clenched. "You don't get to decide what I can carry," he said softly, and Sandra felt the truth of that sentence settle deep in her chest. Claire nodded, shame written across her face. "I know," she whispered. The room went silent again, but this time it wasn't calm. It was electric, charged with emotion that had nowhere to go. Keanu leaned back against the pillows, his breathing uneven. and Sandra moved closer, placing her hand gently on his arm. He didn't pull away. He didn't look at her, but he let her stay there, grounding him. Keanu asked finally, his voice barely steady. Claire shook her head. "Not yet," she replied. "But he's been asking questions. He's been seeing you on TV his whole life." Keanu's eyes filled completely now, and he turned his head away, ashamed of the tears he couldn't stop. Sandra felt her own eyes burn, but she stayed quiet, letting him feel what he needed to feel. Keanu asked after a long pause. "He's in Los Angeles," Claire said, "with my sister." Keanu was silent for a long time, staring at the blanket as if it held answers. Sandra could see his hands trembling slightly, the weight of responsibility crashing down on him all at once. He had spent his life giving quietly, helping strangers, supporting causes, being the kind man people admired from afar. And now he was being asked to face the most personal truth of all, that he had been absent from his own child's life without ever knowing it. "I missed everything," he murmured. "First steps, first words." Claire stepped closer, her voice shaking with urgency. "You didn't choose this," she said. "I chose it for you." Keanu looked up at her then, really looked, and Sandra could see that his anger wasn't for Claire. It was for time, for silence, for a world that had convinced people that protecting someone meant hiding the truth from them. "I can't change the past," he said quietly. Claire nodded quickly. "He's kind," she said through tears. "He's sensitive. He loves to draw. He asks about you without knowing why." Keanu closed his eyes again, a single tear slipping down his cheek. "That's all I ever wanted," he whispered. Sandra felt something shift inside her then, something deep and steady. This wasn't a threat to her place in Keanu's life. This wasn't a complication she needed to fear. This was truth. And truth, even when it hurts, has a way of making things real instead of fragile. She leaned closer and spoke softly, her voice calm but firm. "Keanu," she said, and he turned to her, eyes searching. "You didn't fail him," she continued. "You were kept in the dark." Keanu stared at her, and in his gaze was gratitude so deep it hurt to witness. He asked. Sandra's lips curved into a small, reassuring smile. "Then you learn," she replied. "The same way everyone else does." Claire watched them, her shoulders shaking with sobs she couldn't hold back anymore. "I didn't come to ruin your life," she said desperately. Keanu reached out slowly, his movement careful because of his injuries, and placed his hand over hers. "You didn't ruin anything," he said quietly. "You changed everything." Claire looked at him, stunned, as if she hadn't expected kindness after such a confession. Sandra felt her chest tighten again, because this was who Keanu was, even in shock, even in pain. Compassion first, judgment last. Keanu asked suddenly, his voice steadier now. Claire nodded through her tears. "Yes," she said. Keanu looked down at himself, at the bandages, at the machines, then back at Sandra. "Soon," he said. Sandra squeezed his hand gently. "He doesn't need perfection," she said. As Claire prepared to leave, promising to return the next day, the room fell into a quieter state, but nothing felt the same. The truth had been spoken, and there was no putting it back where it had been hidden. When the door closed behind Claire, Keanu let out a breath that sounded like it came from the deepest part of his chest. "I don't know how to process this," he admitted. Sandra sat beside him, her posture relaxed but attentive. "You don't have to process it all today," she said. Keanu nodded slowly. "I spent my whole life thinking I was alone," he said. "And now—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Sandra understood. "Now you know you weren't," she said softly. The rain outside picked up again, tapping against the window with renewed insistence. But this time it didn't sound sad. It sounded like something being washed clean. Keanu leaned back, exhaustion finally catching up with him, but there was a new light in his eyes, a mixture of fear and hope that hadn't been there before. Sandra watched him carefully, aware that this revelation had cracked something open that would never fully close again. And as the city continued to buzz with rumors and stories that didn't matter, inside that hospital room, a much bigger story had begun, one about truth finding its way into the light, about responsibility born not from guilt, but from love, and about a man learning that the life he thought he knew was only part of the picture. What neither of them fully understood yet was that this truth, once spoken, would demand more courage than silence ever had, and the next steps would test not just Keanu's strength, but Sandra's too, in ways neither of them could have imagined. The weight of what comes next. The night settled over the hospital again, quieter than before, but heavier in meaning, as if the walls themselves were trying to absorb everything that had been said during the day. Keanu lay awake longer than he expected, staring at the ceiling where the faint reflection of passing lights drifted like slow-moving stars. His body was exhausted, every muscle aching, but his mind refused to rest. Words kept replaying themselves in his thoughts, not loudly, not in panic, but with a steady insistence that made sleep feel almost disrespectful. "You have a son." The sentence didn't feel real yet, not fully, but it also refused to leave him alone. It hovered between disbelief and responsibility, between fear and something that felt dangerously close to hope. Sandra sat nearby, reading nothing, turning pages without seeing the words, because she could feel the tension radiating from him even when he didn't speak. She knew that look, the one where he appeared calm but was quietly carrying an entire storm inside his chest. She didn't rush him with questions or reassurance. She had learned over the years that the fastest way to lose someone like Keanu was to crowd their silence instead of respecting it. Instead, she stayed present, her quiet company acting as an anchor in a moment when everything felt unsteady. Eventually, Keanu broke the silence himself, his voice low and thoughtful, as if he were speaking more to the room than to her. "I keep thinking about all the things I didn't know," he said. Sandra closed her book and turned toward him, giving him her full attention. "That's not on you," she said gently. Keanu exhaled slowly, rubbing his hand against the blanket. "I know that logically," he replied. The honesty in his voice cut deep, and Sandra felt the familiar ache of wanting to fix something that couldn't be fixed with words. "You didn't wake up late," she said softly. "You woke up when you were able to." Keanu turned his head slightly to look at her, and in his eyes there was gratitude mixed with uncertainty. He asked. Sandra didn't hesitate. "Then you'll learn," she said. "Every parent does. There's no manual for loving someone that much." The following morning arrived with a restless energy that Sandra felt before she even opened her eyes. There was a hum in the hallway, more footsteps than usual, more voices lowered into whispers, and when she stepped outside briefly to get coffee, she noticed it immediately. Reporters had multiplied. Security was tighter. The hospital staff looked alert in a way that suggested they were bracing for something. Fame, she realized, was circling again, drawn by rumor and curiosity like a tide that never stayed away for long. When she returned to Keanu's room, she found him sitting up, staring at his phone with a conflicted expression. "They know," he said quietly. Sandra frowned. He held up the screen, showing headlines that danced dangerously close to the truth without fully naming it. Whispers of a secret past, unconfirmed reports, questions about visitors. Sandra's jaw tightened. "They're guessing," she said. Keanu nodded, but his eyes were troubled. "I spent years protecting my privacy," he murmured. Sandra moved closer, placing a hand on the edge of the bed. "Then we protect it together," she said.
You don't owe anyone the story of your child. Keanu looked up at her, and something steadied in his gaze. You're right, he said. Later that day, Claire returned, her face pale but determined, as if she had spent the night preparing herself for this next step. She carried a small bag with her, filled with things she thought Keanu might want to see, pieces of a life he had never known existed. She hesitated at the door, uncertainty flickering across her face, and Sandra met her halfway, offering a quiet nod that said, "You're welcome here, even if this is hard." Claire stepped inside and sat down carefully, placing the bag on the chair beside her. "I brought some pictures," she said softly, "and drawings." Keanu's throat tightened, and he nodded, unable to speak at first. When Claire opened the bag and spread the contents across the small table, the room changed. There were crayon sketches of superheroes, rough pencil drawings of city streets, a small stick-figure family with a blank space where a father might be. Keanu stared at them as if they were fragile artifacts, his hands trembling slightly when he reached out to touch one. He asked, his voice barely steady. Claire nodded. "He's always drawing," she replied. Keanu swallowed hard. "I do the same thing," he said quietly. Sandra watched the exchange, her heart aching in a way that surprised her. It wasn't jealousy or sadness. It was the deep recognition of seeing a connection form, invisible but undeniable. Claire took a breath, gathering courage again. "He wants to meet you," she said. Keanu closed his eyes briefly, overwhelmed. "I want that too," he admitted. Claire's voice softened. "So am I," she said. "But he's already imagining you." Sandra nodded quietly from her seat. "Kids know when something important is missing," she said. Keanu opened his eyes and looked between them, two women connected to his life in different but equally powerful ways. "I don't want to hurt him," he said. Claire shook her head firmly. "You won't," she said. Keanu exhaled slowly, then nodded. "Okay," he said. The word tomorrow felt enormous, like a door opening onto a future he hadn't prepared for but couldn't ignore. That evening, after Claire left, the weight of the decision settled in fully. Keanu grew quiet again, retreating into thought, and Sandra could tell he was replaying every version of the meeting in his head, imagining questions he might not know how to answer. She moved her chair closer, breaking the distance deliberately. "You don't have to perform," she said softly. "You don't have to explain everything in one day." Keanu gave a faint smile. "You make it sound simple," he replied. Sandra returned the smile, tinged with sadness. "Simple doesn't mean easy," she said. Keanu looked at her for a long moment, then said something that caught her off guard. "I don't know how I got this lucky," he said. Sandra's breath hitched, but she kept her voice steady. "You didn't get lucky," she replied. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither of them rushed to define. The next morning arrived too quickly. Sandra woke to the sound of Keanu shifting in his bed, his nerves evident in every small movement. He tried to joke about his hospital gown, about how terrible he looked, but Sandra could hear the tension under the humor. "You look like someone about to meet someone important," she said gently. Keanu huffed a quiet laugh. He asked. Sandra nodded. "Terrified people always pretend they're fine," she replied. Sandra didn't sugarcoat her answer. "Then that will hurt," she said honestly. "But it won't mean you failed. Relationships aren't instant." Keanu nodded slowly, absorbing the truth. "I've built a lot of things in my life," he said. Sandra reached out and squeezed his hand. "Then this will be your most important project," she said. When the knock finally came, it sounded louder than any before, echoing in Keanu's chest like a warning bell. Claire stepped in first, her expression tense but hopeful, and behind her was a boy who stopped just inside the doorway. his eyes wide with curiosity and nerves. He was smaller than Keanu expected, thinner, with dark hair that fell into his eyes and a seriousness in his expression that felt far older than his years. Keanu's breath caught instantly. There was no mistaking it. The boy's eyes mirrored his own in a way that made his chest tighten painfully. Sandra felt tears prick her eyes before anyone spoke, and she looked away briefly, giving the moment space. Claire rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Liam," she said gently. The boy swallowed, his gaze fixed on the man in the bed. "Hi," he said softly. Keanu's voice came out rough. The simplicity of the exchange felt monumental, like two lives touching for the first time after running parallel for years. For a few seconds, no one moved. Liam looked around the room, taking in the machines, the bandages, the quiet seriousness of the space. Then his eyes returned to Keanu. "You're the guy from the movies," he said, not accusing, just observing. Keanu smiled faintly. "Yeah," he replied. Liam hesitated, then asked the question that broke every wall at once. The room went still. Keanu's eyes filled instantly, but his voice remained steady. "Yes," he said. Liam studied his face carefully, as if searching for proof beyond words, and then nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. Sandra felt her heart fracture at the simplicity of it, at how easily children accept truths adults complicate with fear. Keanu held out his hand, uncertain, but hopeful. He asked. Liam took a small step forward, then another, until he stood close enough to reach him. When their hands touched, something invisible but powerful seemed to settle into place, like a missing piece finally finding its spot. Claire watched with tears streaming freely now, her shoulders shaking as years of guilt and relief poured out of her. Sandra stayed near the window, giving the moment room while still witnessing it, her chest aching with a mixture of joy and awe. She had seen Keanu be kind to strangers, generous to causes, patient with the world, but she had never seen him like this. Unguarded, vulnerable, changed by a single human connection. Keanu nodded, his voice thick. "I am now," he replied. Liam's mouth curved into a small, shy smile, and in that instant, Sandra understood something deeply. This wasn't just a revelation. It was a rebirth. Keanu wasn't just healing from an accident. He was being given a chance to step into a life he never knew was waiting for him, and the weight of what came next would be heavy, yes, but it would also be meaningful in a way nothing else ever had. And as the city outside continued to buzz with noise that didn't matter, inside that hospital room, a family was beginning. Not perfectly, not easily, but honestly, which was the bravest way it could begin. When the world finally listened. The hours after Liam's arrival passed in a strange, suspended calm, as if the hospital room had slipped outside the normal flow of time and chosen to exist in its own quiet pocket of reality. Keanu sat propped against the pillows, his hand resting gently over his son's smaller one, afraid that if he moved too much, the moment might dissolve. Liam, for his part, seemed torn between curiosity and caution, his eyes darting around the room before always returning to Keanu's face, studying him with the serious focus of a child trying to understand something much bigger than himself. They talked in fragments at first, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much. Liam spoke about school, about a teacher who made math feel like a puzzle instead of a punishment, about how he liked to draw quiet places where people could sit without talking. Keanu listened with an intensity that surprised even him, as if every small detail mattered more than any interview he had ever given, more than any script he had memorized. Sandra watched from her chair near the window, giving them space but never leaving, her heart full in a way that was both warm and painfully tender. She could see how Keanu leaned slightly toward Liam whenever he spoke, how his entire posture softened, and she understood that something fundamental had shifted inside him, something no accident, no rumor, no fear could undo. When Claire finally suggested that Liam might be tired, Keanu felt a wave of disappointment rush through him, quickly followed by guilt for wanting more when he had already been given so much. Liam stood up slowly, slinging his small backpack over one shoulder, then hesitated as if unsure what the rules were now. Keanu noticed immediately. "Hey," he said gently, his voice steady but careful. Liam's face lit up with cautious hope. "Yeah," he said. Keanu nodded, relief washing over him. "I'll be right here," he replied, and Liam smiled in a way that felt like a promise. Before leaving, the boy reached into his backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper, holding it out shyly. "I made this," he said. Keanu took it with reverence, unfolding it slowly. Keanu's breath caught, and for a moment he couldn't speak. Sandra felt tears slip down her cheeks silently as she turned toward the window again, overwhelmed by the quiet beauty of it. "Thank you," Keanu finally managed, his voice thick. Liam nodded, satisfied, and followed his mother out of the room, glancing back once more before the door closed gently behind them. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It wasn't heavy or uncertain. It was full, like a room after music has ended but the echoes are still warm in the air. Keanu stared at the drawing for a long time, tracing the lines with his finger as if committing them to memory. "I don't think I've ever been this scared," he admitted quietly without looking up. Sandra moved closer, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Good," she said softly. Keanu glanced at her, surprised. He repeated. Sandra nodded. "Fear means you care," she replied. "And you care deeply. That's not weakness." Keanu leaned back, exhaling slowly. "I've faced loss," he said. "I've faced grief. But this feels different." Sandra met his gaze steadily. "You won't break him by trying," she said. The truth of her words settled over him like a calm certainty. He nodded once, as if making a quiet vow to himself, not dramatic, not loud, but real. Later that evening, as dusk painted the sky in soft blues and grays, Keanu's phone began to vibrate repeatedly on the bedside table. Sandra glanced at it, then back at him. She asked. Keanu hesitated, then nodded slowly. Sandra picked up the phone and scanned the notifications, her expression tightening. "They're talking," she said. Keanu closed his eyes briefly. He asked. Sandra shook her head. "They're guessing," she replied, "speculating." Keanu's jaw clenched. "I knew this would happen," he murmured. Sandra placed the phone face down. "Then we don't let that happen," she said firmly. Keanu opened his eyes and looked at her, conflict evident in his expression. "But silence lets people write their own version of the truth," he said. Sandra considered this carefully. She knew Keanu well enough to recognize when a decision was forming, slow but unstoppable. She asked. Keanu took a deep breath. "I'm thinking that if the truth is going to come out, it should come from me," he said. "Not as gossip, not as scandal." Sandra's heart skipped. "You don't have to do that," she said. Keanu shook his head gently. "Or I can protect him by telling the truth before someone twists it," he replied. Sandra studied his face, seeing not recklessness, but resolve. Keanu nodded. "I am," he said. The next morning, the hospital room felt charged with anticipation. Sandra could sense it the moment she woke, the air thick with something unspoken. Keanu was already awake, sitting up, his expression calm but focused, the kind of calm that comes before someone steps into something difficult by choice. "I called my publicist," he said quietly when Sandra noticed he was awake. She sat up slowly. He met her gaze. "I asked for a live interview," he replied. Sandra's breath caught. "Keanu," she began. He reached out, taking her hand gently. "I won't say anything I don't want to," he said. "And I won't mention anything Liam doesn't need the world to know." Sandra searched his eyes, then nodded. He smiled faintly. Throughout the day, preparations were made quietly. A small crew was arranged, minimal and respectful. The hospital administration agreed on the condition that everything remained controlled and dignified. Claire was informed, and though fear flickered across her face, she nodded in understanding. "He deserves the truth," she said. When Liam arrived later that afternoon, carrying another drawing and a shy smile, Keanu didn't mention the interview. Instead, he spent the time listening, laughing softly, memorizing the sound of his son's voice, grounding himself in what mattered most before stepping into the noise. As evening approached, the room transformed subtly. A camera was set up, lights adjusted carefully, and a single journalist sat across from Keanu, known not for sensationalism, but for listening. Sandra stood just out of frame, her presence a quiet reassurance, while Claire sat with Liam in a small waiting area nearby, the boy drawing again, unaware of how much his father's next words would change the world's understanding. When the red light on the camera turned on, Keanu didn't straighten his posture or adjust his expression. He simply sat as he was, a man healing, a man choosing honesty. "People have been worried about my health," he began calmly, "and I'm grateful for that concern." He paused, then continued, his voice steady but full of emotion. "But there's something more important I want to speak about. Recently, I learned that I have a son." The journalist's eyes widened slightly, but she remained silent, letting him continue. "I didn't know about him for many years," Keanu said. "Not because I didn't care, but because life is complicated, and sometimes truth gets buried under fear." He took a breath. Liam didn't ask for this attention. He didn't ask for a famous father. He just deserves honesty, love, and protection. Sandra felt tears stream freely now, not from sadness but from pride. Keanu's words weren't dramatic. They weren't defensive. They were gentle, clear, and deeply human. He spoke about responsibility, about learning late but choosing not to run, about how kindness wasn't just something you give strangers, but something you owe the people closest to you. He didn't name names. He didn't offer details for curiosity to feast on. He simply told the truth and claimed it as his own. When the interview ended, the room stayed silent for a long moment. Then Sandra stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did it," she whispered. Keanu exhaled, the tension leaving his body all at once. "I didn't do it for them," he replied softly. Moments later, as if on cue, Liam ran into the room, his drawing held high. "Mom said you were talking on TV," he said. Keanu smiled warmly. "Yeah," he said. Liam tilted his head. Keanu nodded. Liam grinned and climbed carefully onto the edge of the bed, leaning against him. "Good," he said simply. Sandra turned toward the window, watching the city lights flicker on as night fell, her heart full and steady. The world outside was already reacting, headlines shifting from rumor to respect, from speculation to admiration. But inside that room, none of it mattered. What mattered was a man who had finally stopped running, a child who felt seen, and a truth that once spoken had lost its power to hurt and gained the power to heal. The quiet after the storm. The world reacted the way the world always does when something real breaks through the noise, first with shock, then with curiosity, and finally with something softer that people don't always expect from headlines: respect. Keanu didn't watch any of it. He didn't scroll through messages or read articles dissecting his words. Instead, he sat in the hospital room with Liam asleep against his side, the boy's head resting carefully near his shoulder, clutching a sketch pad like a treasure. Sandra sat across from them, legs tucked beneath her, watching the scene with a stillness that felt earned rather than forced. The interview had ended hours ago, and yet the air in the room still carried its echo, not of cameras or questions, but of relief. For the first time since the accident, Keanu's breathing was steady, not because his body was healing, but because his mind had stopped running. He looked down at his son, noticing the slow rhythm of sleep, the way Liam's brow relaxed completely when he felt safe, and a realization settled deep in his chest that surprised him with its calm certainty. This was it. Not the fame, not the films, not the endless expectations, but this quiet responsibility that didn't ask him to perform, only to stay. Sandra eventually broke the silence, her voice low so she wouldn't wake Liam. Keanu glanced up at her, a faint smile touching his lips. "I used to think that too," he replied. Sandra nodded, her eyes warm. "You changed something today," she said. Keanu shook his head gently. "No," he replied. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Sandra understood what he meant. He hadn't created a new life. He had finally stepped into the one that had been waiting for him. And in doing so, he had done something far more powerful than managing an image or controlling a narrative. He had shown his son that honesty wasn't something to fear, and he had shown himself that love didn't arrive on perfect terms, only on real ones. Over the next few days, recovery took on a different rhythm. Doctors came and went, progress was measured in careful steps, and plans were quietly made for Keanu to leave the hospital and continue healing away from the public eye. But what changed most wasn't written in any chart. It was the way Keanu smiled more easily now, not the polite smile people were used to seeing, but something deeper and unguarded. Liam visited every afternoon after school, bringing new drawings, new questions, and stories that seemed small but carried enormous weight. He asked about Keanu's favorite food, about whether he was scared during movies with explosions, about why he liked motorcycles even though they were dangerous. Keanu answered honestly, never exaggerating, never pretending to be a hero. "I get scared," he told him once. Liam nodded seriously, absorbing the lesson like it mattered more than anything he'd learned that day. Sandra watched these moments quietly, her heart full in a way that felt both peaceful and bittersweet. She knew her role wasn't to step into the center of this new family, but to stand close enough to support it without overshadowing it, and that understanding didn't hurt the way she once thought it might. It felt right. Claire, too, began to change under the weight lifted from her shoulders. The guilt that had once shaped every word she spoke softened into something more manageable, something like acceptance. She watched Keanu and Liam together with tears she no longer tried to hide, not from sadness, but from gratitude. One evening when Liam was busy drawing at the small table in the corner, Claire approached Sandra quietly. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere and steady. Sandra looked up, surprised. Claire gestured subtly toward Keanu and Liam. "For staying?" she said. Sandra shook her head gently. "He did the hardest part himself," she replied. Claire nodded. "He did," she agreed. The truth of that settled between them, and in that moment, there was no tension, no rivalry, no unspoken resentment, only shared respect for a man who was finally allowing himself to live honestly. When the day came for Keanu to leave the hospital, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a quiet beginning. There were no flashing cameras, no dramatic exits, just a simple car waiting at a side entrance, security kept discreetly at a distance, and a city that seemed to hold its breath as he stepped outside. Liam stood beside him, holding his hand with surprising confidence, as if he had already decided this was where he belonged. Sandra followed closely, her presence calm and grounding. As the car pulled away, Keanu looked out at the passing streets, feeling the strange familiarity of a world he had navigated for decades, now seen through a different lens. He wasn't thinking about projects or schedules or expectations. He was thinking about school drop-offs, quiet dinners, and learning how to be present in ways he never had before. It terrified him, and it fulfilled him in equal measure. That night at home, long after Liam had fallen asleep on the couch with a blanket pulled up to his chin, Keanu stood by the window, watching the city lights shimmer in the distance. Sandra joined him, handing him a mug of tea without saying a word. They stood side by side, comfortable in the silence they had earned. "I used to think pain was something you had to outrun," Keanu said quietly. Sandra smiled faintly. "Pain teaches you what matters," she replied. Keanu turned to her, his expression open and honest in a way that felt new. "You stayed," he said simply. Sandra met his gaze. "So did you," she replied. The exchange wasn't romantic, not dramatic, not something that needed a label. It was deeper than that. It was trust. In the days that followed, the world moved on to its next story, as it always does. Headlines faded, conversations shifted, and the noise found a new distraction. But inside this small, carefully protected life, something permanent had taken root. Liam felt seen. Claire felt relieved. Keanu felt grounded. And Sandra felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of peace that didn't depend on certainty, only on presence. One evening, Liam brought Keanu his final drawing of the week. It showed 3 figures standing under a wide sky, imperfect and uneven, but smiling. Keanu stared at it for a long time, then pulled his son into a gentle embrace. "Yeah," he whispered. And that was how everything changed forever. Not with a dramatic declaration or a perfect ending, but with honesty, with patience, and with people choosing not to run when life asked them to stay. The rain would fall again someday. Storms would come and go, and challenges would return in different forms, but something essential had shifted. Silence no longer meant isolation. Truth no longer meant fear. And love, once spoken and lived, had found its way home, exactly where it was always meant to be.